Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Morning Rush on this Thursday morning, the 5th of November 2015, the Islamic date being the 22nd of Muharram 1437. We are now into the second half of this morning's show, and inshallah this morning we're going to be crossing to the United Kingdom, where we will be speaking to Sister Yasmine Nahlawi, who is the Advocacy and Policy Coordinator for the Rethink Rebuild Society. And this morning we're going to be focusing on one of the hot Middle Eastern countries at the moment in the news, and that is with regards to Syria. We say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to Sister Yasmine.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Here on Morning Rush this Thursday morning, with regards to the advocacy and being the Advocacy and Policy Coordinator for the Rethink Rebuild Society, do you want to tell us who this organization is, who they represent, and what work does it do?
Sure. We are a Syrian advocacy and community organization based in Manchester in the United Kingdom. So we basically do advocacy work with politicians, we do work with the media to make sure that the Syrian narrative is, gets out in the British public and that it influences decision making within the UK on Syria. We are followed by a very large number of the Syrian community, and we also network with Syrian groups across the country. So we have a very coordinated network of Syrian advocacy within the UK.
What is, with regards to the current situation in Syria, how does your organization see it?
Well, essentially, we see the main problem in Syria being civilian protection at this point. And we always go back to 2011 at the start of the conflict, because that tells you what it's actually about. And the Syrian conflict at its core is that the Syrian people decided to revolt against 50 years of dictatorship by the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad now, and before then his father, Hafiz al-Assad. And it was protests for freedom and dignity, and the government responded with brutal force. So in that sense, the situation escalated, and we are where we are now. Our core demands now is civilian protection. The vast majority of civilians in Syria are killed by the atrocities perpetrated by the Assad regime. It uses aerial attacks to kill civilians in an indiscriminate manner. So what we're arguing for as a starting point is a no-bombing zone for Assad to be denied any ability to bomb his people from the air. So we say that this will save lives, it will reduce the refugee exodus, and it will make a political solution more likely at the same time.
We see you've made mention of the civilian population. With regards to the humanitarian condition of the people in Syria, including the internally displaced people, what has your organization heard about the humanitarian situation there?
The situation is absolutely appalling. It's been classified as the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, according to UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura. We do have a refugee advice service in Manchester, and we help many refugees on a daily basis. And the humanitarian conditions that they have fled from are just simply appalling. It's indiscriminate aerial bombardments. People don't know when they're going to be hit from the sky. They don't know when they're going to return home, or if they're going to return home after leaving. It's a very, very bleak situation. And even if you go out to the refugee camps, it's also a very bleak situation there. It's not a pleasant situation in Syria. And I think that Syrians across the board, no matter what their background is, are going through very difficult times.
We see Russia getting involved in the Syrian crisis. What is the position of Syria with regards to being involved in Syria itself?
Well, first of all, we consider Russia to be an occupying force at this point. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Assad regime is also very much weakened right now. Assad's forces are less than a third their original size. Assad does not have the manpower, and he does not have the capability to continue this. So Assad is very much being propped up by foreign powers. Russia is being a primary actor in this. So Russia is being directly involved with its equipment, with its personnel, and it's directly involved in killing civilians. We also have Iran on board that has deployed troops. We also have Hezbollah similarly deploying troops. We do consider Russia as an occupying power, and also, although Russia justifies its intervention in terms of combating ISIS, we see that overwhelmingly this isn't the case. Russia is not targeting ISIS targets. It's targeting areas that are not even controlled by ISIS. It's directly trying to strengthen the Assad regime at the expense of the civilian population. We've seen so many reports of civilian casualties since Russia started intervening. And in October alone, over 150,000 Syrians were displaced from their homes just because of Russian airstrikes. So Russia is an occupying power. Its involvement is not beneficial on the ground at all. We call on Russia to withdraw. And at the same time, we stress that the need for civilian protection now is as great as it ever was.
With regards to your group calling for a no bombing zone, Sister Yasmine, we've seen in other parts of the world where even MSF hospitals were bombarded. Do you think this call will be justified? And even if you make a call like this, will it be upheld in terms of engagement?
So basically, the no bombing zone model that we're advocating is the least interventionist model. It's the least costly, and yet it's the most effective. So in terms of how it would work, we're not advocating for direct engagement in Syria because we're very wary that the UK government specifically has many reservations about being involved in a more direct manner. So the way it would work is it could be enforced from military assets that we already have existing in the Mediterranean. And it would work through a deterrence model. So, for example, if the Assad regime were to violate a no-bombing zone, and if it were to bomb civilians, then we would respond by a targeted strike at an Assad regime asset, for example, a runway. This avoids many of the issues that come up later. So we're avoiding direct confrontation. We don't need to fly over Syria and destroy the air power of the Assad regime. We don't even need to engage in direct confrontation with Russia. So if Russia is to violate the no-bombing zone and to strike a non-ISIS target, then also we would respond by striking an Assad asset. So that avoids the issue of confronting Russia. There is increased recognition in the UK that civilian protection must serve the underlying premise of any action we take on Syria. We see Cameron's plan to bomb ISIS or to join the U.S. coalition in this regard. We see his plan falling apart because the public and politicians are increasingly realizing that if we don't have a comprehensive solution for Syria that addresses all the issues, so not just ISIS, but also the Assad regime and the need for civilian protection. And if we don't get that comprehensive solution, then we can't really get an end to the Syrian conflict.
Talking about a comprehensive solution, Sister Yasmine, we've seen last week world powers met in Austria to discuss a way forward for Syria. With regards to that meeting, do you think then it is all talk and no action?
Well, I think first thing to point out about the Vienna talks is that there were no Syrians present. And this is something that's very critical for us in terms of we are the Syrians. We are going to be rebuilding our country and we're going to be running our country. Why are negotiations on a peace process or on any diplomatic process not involving us at the table? So Syrian civil society does need to be represented in any sort of talks. Similarly, the other thing we would stress is that civilian protection has to be guaranteed as part of the process. This is our minimum ask at this point. And if we don't guarantee civilian protection, again, there is no way forward in terms of resolving the conflict. Now, in terms of whether the talks are going to work or if anything substantive is going to come out of them, the only thing I can say is we've seen years of peace negotiations. We've seen years of UN special envoys trying to do something for Syria. So we had Kofi Annan, we had Lakhdar al-Brahimi, and now we have UN special envoy Staffan de Mistura. All of them have tried to induce political negotiations. None of them have worked, and the reason that they haven't worked is because the Assad regime is not willing to compromise its stance at all. this point, Assad and Russia have no incentive to sit at a negotiating table and to give up anything. So what we want to do through a no-bombing zone, for example, is to induce them to sit at that negotiating table and to realize that the international community is not going to allow for atrocities to continue. And this is similar to what happened in 2013. When the Assad regime used chemical weapons against civilians, and when the West finally put its foot down and said that we will not allow you to gas your civilians, we saw the Assad regime rush to the negotiating table, and we saw Russia also demanding negotiations. So without a credible show of political will, these negotiations cannot succeed.
We see there was no Syrian representation on these talks, but we also see countries like Saudi Arabia and the United States saying there is no future with Assad being in power in Syria, and firstly, Assad should be removed from power before any political solution to the crisis can be upheld.
Well, absolutely. As Syrians, there is absolutely no legitimacy for Assad or his regime in Syria. And there is no future for Assad in Syria, and we're very clear on that. But at the same time, I think it's also important to stress that political negotiations have never failed because of the opposition. Political negotiations have always failed because the regime was not serious in committing to these talks, and its allies, its backers, Russia, Iran, failed to apply the sufficient pressure on the regime to sit at the negotiating table. And again, it's because they don't have these incentives to sit at the negotiating table. What we need to do is to put that pressure on them and to tell them that you will not be allowed to massacre your civilians anymore, and we do need to solve this problem.
Being a think tank with regards to the Syrian conflict, Sister Yasmine, how then do viewers or readers of the media worldwide know what is the facts and what is not the facts with regards to the Syrian war?
Well, I think the facts don't hide themselves in terms of civilian atrocities and the humanitarian situation. Regardless of where you look, it's very clear that the statistics point to the same root cause of the problem. UN reports, for example, by the Commission of Inquiry on Syria, issue regular reports on the situation there. But I guess regardless of where you look, for example, the humanitarian crisis, the Syrian Network for Human Rights has issued its statistics on the civilian deaths. And regardless of where you look, it's all comparable, and it all points to the vast majority of deaths being perpetrated by the Assad regime. So, for example, the statistics that I just referenced from the Syrian Network for Human Rights say that over 95% of civilian casualties in Syria until now, from the beginning of the conflict, were perpetrated by the Assad regime. If you look at the statistics from 2015, over 75% of the deaths were caused by the Assad regime. Similarly, when we're looking at refugees, a recent poll in Germany cited that the vast majority of refugees are fleeing from the Assad regime. So again, we see that even the refugee exodus is caused by the regime. So I think in terms of wherever you look, as long as you're not looking at maybe the Syrian government's media outlet, because obviously we know that that would just churn out very biased news. But I think across the board, whether you're looking at left or right reporting, the humanitarian situation is reported as it is. Now, the difference in media reporting in various outlets can pertain to what aspect of the conflict is focused on. So, for example, many Western outlets prefer to focus on the issue of ISIS rather than focusing on the conflict as a whole. Now, I think there is truth in that as well, in terms of ISIS is a threat to civilians on the ground in Syria. But at the same time, what we always emphasize as Syrians is that it's just one piece of the larger puzzle. So ISIS does exist at a detriment to civilians, but the reality is that the underlying issue beneath ISIS, and the reason that ISIS is able to be as successful as it is in Syria, is because of the barbaric regime which allowed for ISIS to extend into Syria, but also has allowed it to be propped up in the way that it has been. So even with ISIS, we say that the core issue is the Assad regime.
As part of the Syrian advocacy group, Sister Yasmine, do you see any end to the Syrian conflict, and what is the way forward then?
I think, first of all, we have to recognize that there's no easy solution. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. So if we remember back in 2011, we were talking about peaceful protests. There was no military element, at least for the opposition. And we turned a blind eye towards Syria, and it escalated. We got an armed opposition. We continued to turn a blind eye, and we got ISIS. We continued to turn a blind eye, and now we have the worst refugee crisis in the past 25 years. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to solve it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. At a minimum, what we're advocating is civilian protection, like I mentioned earlier, the no-bombing zone. This has to serve the fundamental way of moving forward, and without it, we don't see how the conflict can be resolved. So a no-bombing zone will, first of all, alleviate the humanitarian crisis. So barrel bombs alone in Syria are responsible for over 200 civilian deaths a week. So it will help the humanitarian aspect of the conflict by reducing lives. A no-bombing zone will also help reduce the refugee exodus, because again, the vast majority of refugees, when they flee Syria, they cite the Assad regime's aerial bombardments as the primary reason they're fleeing. The no-bombing zone will also reduce radicalization, because people are actually being radicalized on the ground because they don't have any other option. When you are bombed from the sky all the time, you become very desperate, and you might do things that you wouldn't normally do if you had protection. So it will also reduce radicalization on the ground. And the last thing that the no-bombing zone will do is it will induce a political negotiation. Again, we see this from 2013 after chemical weapons. If the Assad regime is coerced, or if we apply enough pressure on the regime to set up a negotiating table, it will do that. It's not in a position to confront the West. If there is another way of moving forward in Syria to achieve all of these four objectives, the humanitarian, the refugee, the radicalization, and the political settlement, then we'd be very happy for politicians to put them forward. But at this time, we have not seen any other option that secures these four objectives. And again, I just want to reiterate that we see the way forward in terms of a political solution. But without stopping the aerial bombardments at a minimum, there is no way that this political solution can move forward. And the biggest example of this is 4 years of failed political negotiations. Also, bombing ISIS only without a comprehensive solution, as the U.S.-led coalition has been doing, we also see the results from that. They've been doing it for a year. What results do we see? Absolutely nothing. So if we want to move forward, and if we want to solve all the problems that are coming from the Syrian conflict, the way forward, at a minimum, is a no-bombing zone. Like I said, if there are other options, we're happy to hear them, but no one has been able to put forward anything at this point that is credible.
So we see a long road ahead with regards to finding a political solution to the crisis in Syria. Sister Yasmine Nahlawi, from the Advocacy and Policy Coordinator for the Rethink Rebuild Society from Manchester, United Kingdom, we say Jazakallah for joining us here on Morning Rush this morning and giving us some of your time and insight with regards to the Syrian conflict. We say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me on.
That was Sister Yasmine Nahlawi, based in Manchester, United Kingdom, from the Rethink Rebuild Society with regards to the Syrian conflict. Once again, we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that may He ease the suffering of all the Muslims worldwide. To remember the Syrian people, the Palestinian people and Iraqi people and all the Muslims all over the world where they are affected by conflict and various civil wars in your du'as. Keep watching Morning Rush.